like to welcome everyone to this first lecture of Bethel College's 2019 Menno Simons Lecture Series. This series is produced annually here at Bethel, and it's funded by a fund originally established in 1950 by the John P. and Carolina Schrag Kaufman family, and in 1997 substantially refunded by the William E. and Maida Gehring Yonke family. I am Kip Weedle, and I'm Associate Professor of History and Politics and Chair of the Lecture Series Committee. Tonight, we are pleased to welcome Alain Epp Weaver, a Bethel alum, well known to many of you. Alain is Director of Strategic Planning in the Planning, Learning, and Disaster Response Department of the Mennonite Central Committee. He's been in that position since 2012. Before that, he served in other capacities with MCC, including 11 years of service in the Middle East. After graduating from Bethel with a Bible and religion degree in 1991, he went on to complete a PhD in theology at the University of Chicago. He has published extensively, and his most recent book, which is titled Inhabiting the Land, Thinking Theologically About the Palestinian-Israeli Conflict, came out just last year. The title of this year's lecture series is In the Name of Christ, Missiological Reflections on Mennonite Central Committee's Past, Present, and Future. I should mention we are almost marking the centennial of the founding of MCC. We're off by a year, but close enough. Tonight's lecture is titled Constructing Christian Service, Landscapes of MCC. Please join me in welcoming Alain back to Bethel.
Good evening. Let's begin with an acknowledgement that these lectures are being held on the traditional land of Native peoples. Central Kansas is the traditional homeland of several indigenous nations, including the Osage, Kansa, Wichita, Comanche, and Otsego-Sakowin. In 1830, the Indian Removal Act resulted in many other indigenous peoples coming to Kansas, some through treaty and some through forcible removal. The U.S. government then removed most indigenous nations from Kansas in the late 19th century, sending them to Oklahoma. Please join with me in a moment of silence to lament the suffering of indigenous nations who once had thriving villages and livelihoods here, to honor with gratitude their care for this land, and to remember the ongoing indigenous presence in the land. So it's an honor to be here giving the Menno Simons lectures at Bethel about Mennonite Central Committee, or MCC, initially developed as a temporary ad hoc initiative of multiple Mennonite groups from the United States and Canada in 1920 to respond to the famine that was then being faced by Mennonites in what was then part of Russia and is now Ukraine. MCC has grown over the ensuing decades into a worldwide ministry of Anabaptist churches carrying out relief, development, and peace-building programs in the name of Christ in over 50 countries around the world. Arguably, no other institution has done as much as MCC to shape and construct understandings of what it meant and means to be Mennonite in the 20th and 21st centuries, apart from perhaps Mennonite World Conference. MCC's upcoming centennial this coming year in 2020, offers an appropriate opportunity to reflect on the shifts, tensions, and persistent themes across this MCC century. For many in this audience, MCC is already something of a known quantity. Perhaps you have worked for MCC. Let's have a show of hands. Who's worked for MCC here? Yes. So my guess was correct. So maybe you've worked for MCC, maybe as a PAX volunteer in the 1950s in post-World War II Europe, or with the Teachers Abroad program in the 1960s in a post-colonial African country, or at an MCC office here in the United States. When I was a student at Bethel, multiple faculty had previously worked with MCC in some capacity, and a brief survey of the current faculty confirms that this remains the case. Perhaps you have hosted a young adult from Africa, Asia, or Latin America serving in the US for a year as part of MCC's International Volunteer Exchange Program. Maybe you've packed school kits and relief buckets or stitched and knitted comforters at MCC's Material Resource Center here in North Newton, or have helped canned meat when MCC's mobile meat cannery rolls into town. Or maybe you volunteer or shop, or both, at an MCC thrift shop. Or maybe you donate quilts, make veronica, or bake pies for an MCC relief sale. Perhaps children in your congregation collect pennies, nickels, dimes, and quarters for MCC through My Coins Count, and maybe you give money regularly to MCC. Perhaps you are my mother and have done several of these things. Speaking about MCC to an audience like this, composed primarily of people with some prior knowledge of, engagement with, and even passion for MCC, has distinct advantages, but brings with it the challenge of saying something new. For others of you, these lectures may be the first you have heard of MCC. If that is the case, my hope is that you will nevertheless find questions addressed in these lectures that resonate with you. While the 4 lectures will examine different aspects of MCC's history and present practice, each will ask questions relevant to context beyond Mennonites and MCC. Taken together, these lectures reflect on the meaning of Christian service through the case study of MCC, which has service in the name of Christ as one of its mottos. By examining shifts and tensions within MCC's relief, development, and peace-building work across 100 years, these lectures ask broader questions about who Christian service is for, questions such as who is understood to be serving whom, where does Christian service happen, how is Christian service shaped by a context of colonialism, racism, and gendered hierarchies, how does Christian service relate to broader humanitarian discourses. So, for example, Monday morning's lecture at Convocation will explore varied passions, will explore varied meanings of Christian service and how those meanings have shifted over time. How have passions for Christian service mirrored or conflicted with a patriotic call to serve one's country? Is the language of service inherently unidirectional and thus inextricably bound up with potentially racist, paternalistic, and neo-colonial imaginations of us, in quotes, going out to help them, in quotes? Or can service be conceptualized not as unidirectional giving, but instead as mutual sharing? The changing valences of the word service over the course of a century within MCC will spur reflections on such questions. In the Monday evening lecture, attention will shift to the Christian roots of humanitarianism as a universalizing ideology, of providing assistance without consideration of particular characteristics like race or religion, and tensions between that universalizing vision and the specific call to help one's family, immediate neighbors, and fellow Christians. The Apostle Paul's admonition to the church in Galatia to work for the good of all, and especially for those of the household of faith, which served as a frequent touchstone for MCC in the first three or four decades, embodies this tension, a call to universal love, charity, and good deeds, but with a particular starting point of the church. As a humanitarian relief organization, MCC seeks to manage limited resources faithfully. Negotiating this tension represents an enduring challenge. What distinctive roles do partnerships with local congregations and denominational agencies play for international Christian organizations in carrying out relief, development, and peace-building missions? Finally, the Tuesday evening lecture will begin by examining critiques of development discourses that emerged in the 1970s and 80s, and the ways the development agencies sought to respond and adapt to these critiques. Failures of educational, agricultural, health, and other interventions in the global South by external actors like United Nations agencies, donor governments, and international NGOs like MCC, led to sustained critique within the development world of past efforts, with some seeking to reform development discourse and others wondering if it should be jettisoned altogether. After assessing how such debates played out within MCC in the 70s and 80s, I'll conclude by examining keywords that have shaped MCC missiologies over the past 4 or 5 decades, assessing how terms like accompany, presence, connect, dismantle, and measure have operated and sometimes clashed within MCC's internal discourse. This evening's lecture, with the title Constructing Christian Service, is an attempt to tell MCC's history through an examination of some of the landscapes on which MCC's project of service in the name of Christ has unfolded, and of the imagined geographies the MCC experience has generated. This history makes no pretense of comprehensiveness, chronological development, or even thematic unity. Like many other attempts to narrate MCC's history over the past 70 years, this lecture will inevitably have something of a fragmentary character, offering select snapshots of the MCC experience. To the extent that this lecture has a unifying theme, it is the claim that what MCC service in the name of Christ means has never been static, has often been contested, and has always been under construction. Words such as construction, contestation, and imagined will surface at different points in these lectures, underscoring that what it means to serve in the name of Christ has never in MCC's experience been something fixed and given, but has always been a matter of negotiation and sometimes conflict. The anthropologist Philip Fountain, who conducted ethnographic work studying the operations of MCC Indonesia in the years following the December 2004 tsunami in the Indian Ocean, has described MCC as engaged in translating Christian service, a constant reinterpretation in new contexts of what service in the name of Christ looks like. While Fountain's metaphor of translation has much to commend it, it may also unwittingly suggest that service in the name of Christ has a clear and stable meaning within Mennonite communities in the United States and Canada, and that this fixed meaning then gets transposed into the varied contexts in which MCC operates. The metaphor of construction, I suggest, better captures that the meaning of Christian service and of MCC's service in the name of Christ is always fluid, always being discerned, contested, and constructed anew, both in the US and Canada and in diverse locations around the world. This ongoing process of constructing and contesting Christian service happens, or better put, takes place within specific landscapes, locations in a space-time matrix that people have invested with meanings that are historical and so always changing and shifting. People's locations have shaped how they have understood the call to serve in the name of Christ, and service through MCC has in turn generated new terrains of spiritual kinship, new mappings of the church, and of the identity of the neighbors and enemies whom Christians are called to serve. As a way of making this theoretical argument more concrete, I'll share some of my own personal MCC geography, charting the imagined landscapes constructed through my engagement with MCC from childhood until the present, and examining how these landscapes have shaped my understanding of Mennonites and Christian service. By referring to imagined landscapes, I'm not suggesting that the specific places through which my mental maps of MCC, Mennonites, and Christian service were formed were imaginary, as in non-existent. Rather, my invocation of imagined landscape seeks to highlight 2 points. First, that encounters with places are historically constructed and ever-changing, and thus are sites of potential contestation and conflict. And second, that it is through these historically constructed and negotiated encounters with places that individual and social identities are formed. Some markers then in my MCC landscape. My first remembered encounter with MCC was as a child in the basement of my family's home in Lincoln, Nebraska, playing with the musical instruments my parents had brought back with them from a service term as newlyweds in the mid-1960s in what is now the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It was also in this basement that my parents occasionally set up the Kodak projector to present slideshows, visualizing the 2 years they spent in the 1960s teaching Congolese high school students through MCC's Teachers Abroad program, or TAP, in a school founded by Swedish Protestant missionaries in the village of Sundi Luteti. Sorry, Mom, if I got that pronunciation wrong. These slideshows simultaneously evoked in me a nostalgia for a past I did not personally experience and provoked a restless yearning to see a very different world beyond my white middle-class Lincoln neighborhood. These projected images of Congolese people and landscapes nurturing a sense of service as adventure. Years later, I also wondered if these slideshows unwittingly fostered a racialized understanding of Christian service as something carried out by white Christians from the West to and for Black and brown peoples around the world. A few years later in grade school or early junior high, I stood in an exhibition hall at the county fairgrounds in Aurora, Nebraska, on the weekend of the Nebraska Mennonite Relief Sale, the proceeds from which went to support MCC's global efforts. I watched my uncle successfully bid on a commemorative MCC belt buckle. I ate my fill of the pierogi-like Varenica and farmer sausage that were the culinary staples of my father's extended German-Russian family centered in Henderson, Nebraska. My father explained that the sale was operated not just by Mennonites from the General Conference Mennonite Church of my parents' families, but also by members of the Mennonite Brethren Church in Henderson and the Old Mennonite Church in York. This relief sale day reinforced my ethnic and religious identity, yet my time at the relief sale also broadened my map of the Mennonite landscape, introducing exotic new names and places for that map, such as Mennonite Brethren, Old Mennonite, and York. At this Nebraska MCC relief sale, service united people around divides of doctrine and practice, creating new maps of ecumenical cooperation. Around this time, I began volunteering weekly at Helping Hands Handcrafts, a new fair trade venture in Lincoln that sold products for MCC's Self-Help Crafts venture. Self-Help Crafts had grown out of the initiative of Edna Ruth Byler in the 1950s to organize trunk shows in church basements of handicrafts from Puerto Rico and the West Bank. Helping Hands later became an MCC 10,000 Villages store. Unpacking and selling soapstone dishes, jute basket hangers, and olive wood nativities connected me to artisans in Kenya, India, and the West Bank, and to a vision of service as the promotion of global fair trade that pays producers a living wage. A few years later, I sat in my family's living room, reading through a copy of the Washington Office Memo, published by MCC's office in Washington, D.C., searching for material to use in high school debate and extemporaneous speech competitions. My mental map of MCC, Mennonites, and service expanded to include public policy advocacy in the halls of government power. Several years later, my spouse and I began our lives as newlyweds in an apartment above a garage about a block away from here in North Newton. For suppers, we cooked through the pages of the More with Less cookbook, compiled by MCC worker Doris Jansen Longacre and first published by MCC and Herald Press in 1976. These culinary explorations connected us to thousands of households across the US, Canada, and beyond that were also inspired by Jansen Longacre's vision of Christian service as bound up with domestic decisions, such as what and how to cook, a vision that linked Mennonite kitchens to global challenges of hunger, the just sharing of resources, and care for the environment. Since its publication more than 40 years ago, the More with Less cookbook has sold over 1 million copies around the world, making it arguably the most effective outreach tool Mennonites have ever produced. A decade later, my spouse encountered a group of Israeli Jewish homeschooling mothers in Jerusalem who enthusiastically sang the praises of the More with Less cookbook. A year after college, Sonia and I moved to the small village of Zababde in the north of the occupied West Bank to teach English at a Catholic school. This initial 3-year MCC assignment eventually expanded into a total of 11 years of work with Palestinians in the occupied West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem. Sent by MCC to the olive tree-covered hills of the northern West Bank and the cramped cinder block homes of Gaza's refugee camps, our MCC administrators instructed us that Christian service was less about classes to teach or reports to write, and more about presence, about sitting under our landlord's fig tree to drink cup after cup of sage-flavored tea and slowly learning to communicate in Arabic. Over the course of a decade, drinking countless cups of tea and coffee with neighbors, co-workers, and friends in a context of military occupation, our imagined landscape of Christian service expanded and became more complex as we learned that Christian service as peace building demanded ecumenical and interfaith collaboration as well as advocacy for unpopular causes. Finally, a little over a decade ago, we moved to Lancaster County in southeastern Pennsylvania, where I began an administrative job at MCC at its headquarters in the quiet township of Akron. The same small village where MCC leader Ori Miller operated a shoe factory in the first part of the 20th century. Akron occupies a place on the Mennonite world map much larger than its actual size, which is quite small. Over the past decade, I've welcomed longtime MCC workers and partner representatives from countries like Nigeria, Zambia, India, and Indonesia coming for meetings to Akron for the first time, who expressed surprise that Akron, which in some Mennonite mental landscapes functions as the Vatican of the global Mennonite world, is simply a sleepy, quiet township of a few thousand people, not a bustling urban center like Jos, Nigeria, or Lusaka, Zambia, but a hamlet where one awakens to the clip-clop of horses on the street pulling Amish buggies. From the vantage point of an administrator in Akron, my mapping of the MCC world yields less of the command and control organizational chart of a modern corporation with Akron at the center or the top, but more of a rhizome-like network in which MCC keeps expanding outward in increasingly complex ways from multiple nodes. I've not started with a sort of my own personal geography of MCC because it is broadly representative or comprehensively descriptive. Quite the opposite, I've begun with my personal MCC landscape precisely to highlight that there is not simply one MCC story of service in the name of Christ, but many. There are diverse geographies of MCC service represented here in this room this evening. And this diversity is but a small part of MCC's global landscape. Even as MCC has operated to create new types of Anabaptist Mennonite identity and shared understandings of Christian service, one's encounter with MCC and one's understanding of service in the name of Christ are nevertheless powerfully shaped by the formative landscapes one inhabits, including landscapes of national, religious, racial, and gendered identity. MCC landscapes of service can vary significantly just within the relatively limited geography of southeastern Pennsylvania. From meat canning events organized on farms by Old Order Amish and Mennonite districts, to youth groups from Hmong and Nepali Mennonite churches volunteering at MCC's Material Resource Center in Ephrata, Pennsylvania, to the placements of young adults from Africa, Asia, and Latin America in one-year service assignments at Mennonite schools in Lancaster County, to recent graduates of the Brethren in Christ College Messiah in Grantham, leaving the United States for a year of service in countries like Honduras, Lebanon, and Mozambique. The diversity of MCC geographies of service expands and becomes more complex as one zooms out from southeastern Pennsylvania to take a more global view. A very unrepresentative snapshot of the global landscapes of MCC service could include the following. A Church of God in Christ Mennonite woman in central Kansas, who pieces and knots comforters that will be shipped globally for distribution to displaced families. A retired Mennonite Brethren man in Abbotsford, British Columbia, who volunteers at an MCC thrift store. an Indonesian Mennonite man in Salatiga, Indonesia, who oversees MCC disaster responses with Indonesian Mennonite churches, a Muslim woman in Kolkata, India, who for decades has coordinated MCC's educational partnerships, a young man from a Low German Mennonite colony in Paraguay's Chaco region, spending 2 years traveling across the United States and Canada while working on MCC's mobile meat canner. Sorry, just a second. A Protestant Nigerian man who has led interfaith peace-building efforts in several African countries and now leads MCC's program in Zimbabwe. Or a Cambodian woman working for a year on forestation and food security projects in Haiti's Atibonite Valley. One could quickly come up with scores more snapshots of global MCC landscapes, each opening a vista onto what service in the name of Christ looks like, each distinct while also bearing some similarities to one another. Taking a global view reveals MCC as a complex, shifting field of interconnecting, sometimes overlapping landscapes of service, with MCC both creating new imagined landscapes of identity and connection, and with that complex network of rhizome-like connections shaped and changed in turn by new challenges to and discoveries about Christian service within different geographies. Telling part of MCC's complex 100-year history, as I'm seeking to do in these lectures, could proceed by focusing on a wide variety of MCC landscapes, examining the questions those landscapes raised and continue to raise for MCC about the nature of Christian service. One could, for example, map the terrain of practical inter-Mennonite ecumenism created through MCC. MCC relief sales, thrift shops, mobile meat canning events, and material resource centers. At these places, inter-Mennonite connections and expanded understandings of Anabaptist Mennonite identity through collaboration and service have been forged. During World War II, MCC administered civilian public service camps not only brought Mennonite young men and women with diverse theological commitments together to carry out alternative service to war, they also operated as educational venues in which MCC sought to strengthen the religious identity of Mennonite young adults through the distribution of specially commissioned pamphlets on Mennonite history and theology, and through the organization of educational events. Following World War II, as MCC Paxmen carried out alternative service obligations through relief and reconstruction efforts in post-war Europe, MCC sought to nurture and reinforce an inter-Mennonite commitment to non-resistance, organizing regular conferences about the meaning of Mennonite peace witness. Meanwhile, MCC's arguably oldest partner globally is Mennonite World Conference, a global fellowship of Anabaptist churches founded only 5 years after MCC in 1925. To be sure, inter-Mennonite cooperation through MCC has often proven fragile, with some churches wary, even at MCC's beginnings, of too close collaboration with one another, and with conflict over doctrine, ethics, and visions of Christian service testing commitment to inter-Mennonite partnership. I'll discuss examples of such inter-Mennonite tensions and conflicts around MCC in the following lectures. Yet even amid such conflict, MCC has worked to nurture readiness among Mennonite churches with markedly different theological and ethical visions to nevertheless cooperate on particular tasks. Over the decades, MCC administrators and board members have found that this commitment to inter-Mennonite collaboration is never fully solidified, but must always be tended, reinforced, and won anew. Another way to map MCC's story would be to explore how MCC has operated within and been shaped by landscapes of war and revolution. From the distribution of emergency relief supplies to displaced peoples in post-World War II Europe, to service programs carried out in Vietnam in the midst and in the aftermath of the US-led war in the country, to communicate to community development workers placed in rural communities in El Salvador and Nicaragua during times of revolutionary unrest and US-backed military repression, to partnerships for relief and reconstruction today with Syrian churches seeking to show Christ's love in practical ways to the millions of Syrians uprooted by the ongoing civil war. Within such landscapes, MCC has encountered questions such as, how does Christian service look like and differ from military service? What type of cooperation and coordination with governments and militaries are justifiable for a Christian organization committed to nonviolence as it carries out relief and development programs? Are Mennonites called to advocate to the governments of the US and Canada, not only for conscientious objector status, but also against the globalized militarism of these states? What does Christ-like presence among and solidarity with oppressed and marginalized peoples look like within revolutionary contexts in which one's neighbors, including one's Christian neighbors, are sympathetic to revolution? Or one could tell MCC's story of service in the name of Christ by mapping landscapes of forced displacement and migration and MCC's operation within such landscapes. From MCC's decision in 1949 to establish a relief and rehabilitation unit amidst the Palestinian refugee camps around Jericho and the Jordanian-controlled West Bank, following the Arab-Israeli war that displaced 2/3 of the Palestinian population, to MCC Canada responding to the so-called Vietnamese boat people crisis by negotiating with the Canadian government in the late 1970s to allow Mennonite congregations to sponsor Vietnamese refugees for resettlement as newcomers to Canada, to MCC accompanying a community like Mampuhan in Colombia as it sought justice and compensation after a massacre in the village in 2002 led to the village's abandonment, to MCC today working with churches and community-based groups along the Mexico-US borderlands to support asylum seekers and other new migrants from Central America, including by distributing care kits to migrant detainees from the US government's militarized detention centers. Mennonites of European background have often narrated their histories of ones of displacement and of migration in the search for religious freedom and liberty. Through MCC, Mennonites in Canada and the US have been confronted with the role of their nation states in directly and indirectly creating mass displacement, and with how Jesus' command to visit prisoners, feed the hungry, and give water to the thirsty calls them to place welcoming refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants above nationalist politics of exclusion and militarized borders. The types of landscapes that have shaped the MCC story are numerous and diverse. One could spend an entire lecture series simply seeking to enumerate all of the landscapes in which the story of MCC service in the name of Christ has taken shape over a century, and one would simply be scratching at the surface. For the rest of this lecture, I will look more closely at one specific way to map the MCC story, namely through an analysis of the colonial, racialized, and decolonizing landscapes that have shaped and continue to shape MCC service in the name of Christ. Most of the contexts in which MCC has operated have been shaped by ongoing legacies of colonialism, be it how transatlantic trafficking in enslaved humans from Africa helped to form the United States since its beginning and before its beginning, or through the settler colonialism practiced in the United States, Canada, South Africa, or Israel-Palestine, or through the extractive colonialism undertaken by the United Kingdom in countries like India, Kenya, and Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, Belgium, and what is now the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the French in places like Chad and Burkina Faso, and the Spanish across Latin America. How have these legacies of colonialism shaped MCC's understanding and practice of Christian service? To what extent have MCC understandings and practice of Christian service embodied colonialism's racialized hierarchies of value, of a white, resourceful, advanced Christian West going out to serve among indigenous, Black, and brown peoples in the global South, marked by need and portrayed as less advanced, at best, and primitive and savage, primitive or savage at worst. How can an organization like MCC work deliberately to decolonize its practice of Christian service, to free itself of captivity to colonial understandings of service marked by a condescending, unilateral, and often racialized movement of service from the global north to the global south, and in that process discover different models of Christian service? These questions aren't new within MCC, and I'll be circling back to these types of questions throughout the ensuing lectures. In tomorrow morning's lecture, I'll trace debates within MCC from the early 70s and into the 80s that led to a redefinition of service as presence, listening, and mutual sharing. While in Tuesday evening's lecture, I'll examine MCC critiques in the 80s of modernization's development discourses, the replicated colonial value hierarchies, and MCC's attempts to identify alternative models of development. In the remainder of this evening's lecture, I'll examine some of the colonial and racialized landscapes of service in MCC's history, as well as some of the ways MCC has sought to participate in the decolonization of those landscapes. The vocabulary of colonies and colonization can be traced to early in MCC's history. Alongside MCC's first relief response in the 1920s among starving Mennonites and other Russians in the parts of Russia once home to the Mennonite colonies of Krtitsa and Molochno, Mennonites in the US and Canada organized what they termed boards of colonization to prepare for the potential settlement of Mennonite immigrants from Russia in the Plain states and provinces. With immigration barred to the US, only the Canadian Mennonite Board of Colonization, in collaboration with the Canadian Pacific Railway, ended up settling Mennonite immigrants in the early 1920s, settling them on land the Canadian government had cleared by extinguishing Indigenous land claims through treaties. As former MCC Canada worker and historian Esther Epp Weaver explains, the Canadian Mennonite Board of Colonization, one of the precursor agencies to what became MCC Canada, often portrayed the land on which these new Mennonite immigrants from the Soviet Union settled on as an empty, promised land of opportunities, the Indigenous history of the land erased from view. MCC's second major initiative involved assistance to Mennonite refugees fleeing the Soviet Union in colonizing the Paraguayan Chaco between 1930 and 1932, after the Paraguayan government had made land in the Chaco available for settlement, the traditional lands on which the nomadic indigenous Lengua and Kulupi people hunted and gathered. A 25th anniversary history about and by MCC in 1945 presented this colonization enterprise as an epic story, a story recounted in this silver anniversary booklet in dramatic prose that likened the 10,000-mile pilgrimage by 2,000 penniless refugees to the journey of the Israelites to the Promised Land, as well as to the conquest of the plains by, quoting here, the American frontiersmen who crossed the Alleghenies after the Revolution. The booklet's author described these Mennonite immigrants to the Chaco as facing, quote, a primitive and unsettled wilderness. By unsettled, one must hasten to add, the author meant settled by Europeans, for soon the author refers to the presence of Aboriginal Indians. Observing that skeptics had claimed that the Chaco was impossible to settle, the author recounted with pride and admiration that in less than 25 years' time after time, these settlers have demonstrated beyond doubt what Paraguay failed to accomplish in over 400 years of control, that white men can live and make a living in the interior of the Chaco. They survived plague and pests, wild animals, and unfriendly Indians, the rigors of a strange semi-tropical climate, and the trials of adjustment to a totally different type of agriculture, the perils of internal dissension, and the problems of inaccessible markets. Like Caesar, the author concluded, the Mennonite settlers came, they saw, they conquered, but peacefully. Part of this self-described peaceful conquest by these Mennonite immigrants who settled the Chaco with MCC support involved what Paraguayan Mennonites viewed as a civilizing mission. Hans Epp, a Paraguayan Mennonite from the Fernheim colony and longtime medical missionary among the indigenous peoples of the Chaco, shared with the MCC board in 1973 that Paraguayan Mennonites took their encounter with the Lengua tribe as being by divine providence. Epp sought to distance Mennonites from responsibility for the precarious plight of the indigenous people of the Chaco, stressing that the Mennonites did not come to Chaco because of the Indians. They had legally purchased the land, and their biggest desire was to live free, peaceful, and according to the dictates of their conscience. They were looking for a new home. However, Epp continued, upon meeting the Lengua and seeing many of their struggles and their problems, Paraguayan Mennonites organized a multifaceted mission of evangelization, education and health initiatives, and the promotion of modern farming techniques, a mission they named Licht den Indianen, or Light to the Indians. In contrast, other Mennonite discourse around colonization erased indigenous presence from view. In 1945, in the context of discussions about developing more formalized and institutionalized Mennonite mutual aid mechanisms, including for young men completing alternative service commitments during World War II through the CPS mechanism, MCC commissioned J. Winfield Fretz, then a professor of sociology here at Bethel College, to write a booklet entitled Mennonite Colonization, Lessons from the Past for the Future. Fretz's aim in the booklet was to identify factors that strengthened or weakened community cohesion as Mennonites migrated from place to place. Strikingly absent from Fretz's discussion of Mennonite colonization in the plains of the US and Canada in the 1870s was any acknowledgement of the indigenous people who had previously lived on the land, or the role of state power in clearing indigenous people from the land as a prelude to opening it up for colonization by white settlers of European descent. A well-educated, thoughtful scholar, Fretz would have, of course, been aware of the prior indigenous histories of places such as Gossel, Kansas, Henderson, Nebraska, Freeman, South Dakota, or Steinbach, Manitoba, which makes the absence of reference to indigenous peoples in the book about Mennonite colonization stand out all the more. Colonial legacies have also shaped MCC service programs. The potentially colonial character of Christian service was not foreign to the young adults from the US and Canada sent by MCC through its Teachers Abroad program in the 60s and early 70s to help staff government and Protestant mission schools in newly independent African countries which sought to chart new paths of independence from the former colonial powers, while also turning to the educational systems inherited by the colonial powers as vital tools for freedom and development. MCC placed TAP teachers in countries like Nigeria, Congo, and Malawi that had recently emerged from direct colonial control. Some of these MCC workers struggled with what that meant for Christian service. Ken Lorenz, a TAP worker in Tanzania in the early 1960s, observed that new TAP teachers should expect to, quote, come in contact with some expatriates whose attitudes about Africans and the corresponding thoughts they express follow the channels of colonial attitudes rather closely, warning these new MCC workers that without deliberate, conscious effort, they would find themselves adopting a colonial mindset as well. However, disentangling themselves from the colonial legacies of the countries in which they served proved challenging for TAP teachers, especially when these MCC workers lived and worked within colonial structures. In an April 1966 report about his TAP assignment at a Swedish Protestant mission school in Sundilutete, north of Matadi in Congo, Anthony Epp, who, full disclosure, was my father, wrote of the awkwardness of living in the quote-unquote white camp, as the students so aptly call our segregated part of the mission post, observing that it is really difficult to enjoy the comforts of a nice house when one knows that one has such comforts because one has a white skin, and when one learns that the money which had been set aside to improve student quarters has been poured into the construction of one's own comfortable house. Several times recently we have encountered the astounding philosophy that it is only natural to look after the housing needs of white teachers before those of the Congolese who are already used to living in poor conditions. It is on hearing such attitudes from quote-unquote missionaries that one begins to understand why missionaries are not always loved. A month later, Epp shared that he and his spouse had made conscious efforts to invite students and Congolese teachers over to eat in their part of the mission post, and had in turn been invited by Congolese to eat with them. Epp reported that time and again the remark comes back that we are so happy to have you eat with us, for we are accustomed to having the Europeans bring their own food and go off to eat separately. One really gets the impression, Epp continued, that in being made Christian, these people have, in the sense, been somewhat dehumanized. Perhaps we'll be able to make a contribution in this area. At least we are trying to do so. Over the ensuing decade, MCC would increasingly seek to place MCC workers in grassroots assignments outside of mission compound walls, and with a stress on sharing daily life with the everyday people whom one had come to serve, eating and drinking tea with them, celebrating and mourning with them, and becoming conversant in local languages rather than colonial languages. And as will be discussed further in tomorrow morning's lecture, unidirectional models of service gave way within MCC to understandings of service as mutual sharing and as multi-directional. The shift in how service was understood went hand in hand with two other developments that began to emerge from the 80s onwards. First, MCC began to reflect more explicitly on the essential role of in-country nationals in carrying out its relief, development, and peace-building service, and to grapple with what truly equitable intercultural teams might look like. And second, with the rise of civil society institutions across countries in the global South, MCC's primary mode of operation shifted from direct implementation of program to partnerships with churches and other local organizations, partnerships that MCC hoped would be marked by what it called mutual transformation. We'll return more in the lecture on Tuesday evening to examine the rhetoric of mutual transformation more closely. Meanwhile, workers in MCC voluntary service units in Canada and the United States came face to face with the colonial and racialized characters of their own countries. In the mid-1950s, MCC established a voluntary service unit in Newfoundland with a primary emphasis on service within First Nations communities, a program that would help inspire the Teachers Abroad program in the 1960s. Over the ensuing decades, MCC workers in Newfoundland and in other assignments within Canada's First Nations were confronted with Canada's colonial history, its dispossession of Canada's Indigenous peoples, and the hard and yet ultimately hopeful reality that reconciliation between Indigenous and settler Canadians requires truth-telling and justice. In the United States, meanwhile, workers in MCC voluntary service units in places such as Gulfport, Mississippi, founded in 1946 alongside a civilian public service camp, and Atlanta, led during part of the 1960s by civil rights leaders Vincent and Rosemary Harding, were confronted with a stark racial discrimination in the Jim Crow South, as well as the colonial legacies of the transatlantic trade in enslaved humans that had shaped the United States from its inception. Over time, MCC also began to reckon with the fact that the colonial legacies of dispossession and racism in the United States and Canada were not simply external to MCC and Mennonite communities in the two countries. MCC US's Damascus Road Anti-Racism Program, founded in the 1990s, took the lead in highlighting that the white supremacist project that had shaped and continues to shape the United States had also shaped Mennonite churches, communities, and MCC itself. Such anti-racist analysis has underscored the disentangling MCC service from colonial mindsets and patterns is not a simple matter of a one-time decision, but instead an ongoing process of commitment and discernment. 3 years ago, Eileen Clausen-Ham, who currently serves as executive director for MCC Saskatchewan, reflected on a long process in her province related to legacies of colonialism in Canada. In 1897, the Canadian government unilaterally took over the land which had been allotted to the young Chippewayan band to use for European settlement. This land includes a hill sacred to the young Chippewayan, which they name Opwashamochakatanau. German-speaking Mennonites and Lutherans from what is now Ukraine then settled on this land, farmed, raised families, and passed down title deeds issued by the Canadian government within their families. Members of the young Chippewayan band, meanwhile, have passed down stories and traditions associated with Opwashamochakatanau from generation to generation, along with the claim of a violated treaty. For more than 2 decades, MCC has accompanied members of these Mennonite, Lutheran, and young Chippewayan First Nation communities in discussing what justice and reconciliation might look like on the land that they all love and call home. They have required time, patience, commitment, and for the Mennonite and Lutheran settlers, the humility to listen and to sit with ambiguity. We as settlers need to return again and again to humble learning, Colonial emphasizes. We continue to want to control and manage the process. We still think we know what is best. I would suggest that Colonial's admonition for a return again and again to humble learning is good counsel for MCC as it prepares to embark on a 2nd century of service in the name of Christ. A centennial, to be sure, it represents a time for celebration and for thanksgiving to God. Yet Christian service through relief, development, and peace-building efforts is, like all human affairs, complicated, at times messy and ambiguous, and sometimes deeply flawed and marked by failure. The optimism animating much humanitarian action can sometimes result in humanitarianism becoming a form of uncritical triumphalism. That impulse can certainly be found in MCC's 100-year history. Yet MCC has also undertaken a patient, non-triumphalist form of Christian service, a form of Christian service that relinquishes the need for unilateral control, a form of Christian service that instead patiently sits with churches and local organizations to discern how best to work together at the tasks of relief, development, and peace building, a form of Christian service that does not map a terrain to be controlled, but rather enters a landscape of mutual hospitality and sharing. Thank you.
Okay, we have some time for questions.
Thought Mark was coming up to ask a question. And feel free just to ask questions about MCC too. It doesn't just have to be about this lecture.
I can think of dilemmas, like when Peter Dick had to do a little fakery, or MCC in Vietnam decided they had to exit, but another voluntary service group stayed. At least my brother stayed with that second group after MCC fell and had to leave. And I don't have any answers. It's just interesting, all the dilemmas that MCC gets involved in.
Yeah, certainly a fair bit of moral ambiguity at times in different MCC settings. True. I mean, one could argue that can happen close to home all the time. You don't have to go to Vietnam to experience moral ambiguity and Christian service. That can happen right here at home.
So, Alan, I know that we've talked a lot about this when we worked together, but this whole issue of colonialization, I wonder how you reflect on your position on planning and the whole exercise of strategic planning and results-based management as it relates to colonialism.
Come to the Tuesday evening lecture where we'll talk about how an outcomes-based planning or results-based management, which is part and parcel not just of the academic world, but also of the nonprofit world, of global relief, humanitarian relief, development efforts, how that sits in tension with, does it sit in necessary conflict with, or just tension with a missiology of presence, of listening and learning. I'd like to think, as the director of our planning and learning department, who is partly responsible for engaging our programs worldwide on outcomes-based planning, that it's not an irreconcilable tension, or it's not a tension that means unmitigated conflict, but it's rather a tension to be navigated. That's what I'd like to think. But we'll talk about that more at the Tuesday evening lecture.
I would imagine that there are more local people, whether Mennonite or not, who are either employees or volunteers with MCC. Could you talk about that some?
Yeah, I think I mentioned that briefly at one point about how, there have always been people, like Congolese or Zimbabweans or Indians or Indonesians who have worked for MCC, but those numbers have, the importance and profile of our national staff, as we refer to those workers in MCC, has increased. And the emphasis over the past 20, 30 years has been a strong emphasis on trying to create more truly equitable intercultural teams where you don't have a de facto two-tier unit of the service workers, who are primarily from the United States and Canada, and then the national staff, but rather have an intercultural team where all are equal members of the team. Of course, there are lots of complications and challenges with creating truly equitable teams like that. The other thing that's happened, and we'll talk more about this in tomorrow morning's lecture, is the increase in MCC service workers who are from outside the United States and Canada. So at present, I'd say around 20 to 30%, probably more like 20 to 25% of our country program leadership is from outside of the US and Canada. So our representatives in our Mexico program are from Colombia, or the representatives for our Zimbabwe program are from Nigeria. And so that's been something that has been accelerating over the past 10 to 20 years.
In light of what you just shared, my sense is that we're going to be challenged at MCC with constituency getting much older and support challenged for the support of these programs. You mentioned the staffing is coming from others, which I would affirm and feel positive about. But the constituency still needs to support the projects that are ongoing. Where's that going to come from?
Yeah, no, it's definitely a balancing act, and again, we'll talk more tomorrow morning about shifting understandings of service and who is serving. It's definitely a priority for MCC to continue to have service opportunities globally. We have our one-year SALT program, which I can enthusiastically report is a wonderful program because my daughter just got back from a year in El Salvador with the SALT program. Seemed to have done her good. 2-year SEED program, which is for young adults from Canada, the US, but then who also work as a unit with people from the region, like in Bolivia or Colombia. And we continue to have lots of 3-year and longer term workers as well from the US and Canada. But it's at the same time, more governments are placing restrictions on visas, number of visas MCC can issue, expectations about professional skills that people bring. All of these, make for a challenging mix of offering a wide variety of service opportunities. And at the same time, younger people, of course, are coming out of university with greater indebtedness than ever before, which makes undertaking a term of service a challenging prospect. So we want to continue to provide service opportunities for Christians in the US and Canada, including from our Anabaptist Mennonite constituency. And it's also the case that our fundraising colleagues are, very concerned about, not concerned in the sense of worried, but they're very passionate about seeking to engage newer generations of people in MCC service, whether that's service globally, whether that's service through engagement in material resource centers and relief sales and meat canning. And so all I can say is appeal to you to help us with engaging those younger generations. We've got some help. I see our MCC colleagues have put out some helpful information that you're free to take. I'm shifting from dispassionate academic mode now into sales mode. But you raise a very important question.
Alan, I do have a question I want to ask. So as you think about laying out sort of MCC's identity and who they work with, and then trying to think about, is this a post-colonial identity and how that all functions, I'm thinking that one hears a number of different sort of post-colonial discourses. The one that you might hear in North American Academy is different than the one you might hear talking to Congolese Christians.
Sure.
Or I don't know how that plays out in Asia. And maybe that's something you'll talk about in a later lecture. But so I'm interested in, out of all of those different kinds of discourses, how do you know which ones to listen to and highlight and lift up? And I'm thinking that's actually probably been an issue for MCC
Sure.
for a very long time. How do we listen to Paraguayan Mennonites in the 30s and 40s, and how do we listen to European Mennonites in the 50s and 60s? And one can find that parallel. So I'm just curious, from where you sit, how does that function, that MCC sort of decides what advice to listen to from all those partners and all those voices?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So, because on the one hand, you can develop a missiology of presence and of listening to partners, but that just in some ways begs the question of, well, who are the partners and how are you choosing them? MCC is committed to engaging Anabaptist churches around the world in the context in which it operates. Engagement doesn't necessarily mean giving financial resources or material resources or seconding personnel in all cases, but there's a commitment to maintaining and nurturing relationship. And so there's a commitment to, so in some ways, we talk about MCC as a relief, development, peace building organization, but a theme that'll come up in more than one lecture is MCC is this ecumenical driver, an inter-Anabaptist ecumenical driver of seeking to form and forge connections with others who claim the name Anabaptist. And so there's a commitment to that relationship. That's one sort of given. Sometimes those relationships are filled with some tension at times, but other times they're very warm, and there's a clear alignment with what MCC has set out as its values and sort of its high-level mission and vision statements and its internal documents. But then you get to the question of, well, who are our other partners? Because we don't only work with Anabaptist Mennonite churches. And so there, we're committed to engaging and supporting in appropriate ways churches in whatever context we also work in, but also with community-based organizations. And so there, it's very much an ongoing context-specific discernment of what do we understand to be our values as articulated by the churches here in the US and Canada that support us and to which we are accountable through our boards, but also but how country programs discern what are the local churches, the local organizations that have visions and values that align in some way or intersect with what MCC is about.
I'll risk a question that's poorly formulated in my head.
Sure.
You know, I too remember parents and grandparents who were very passionate about the early work of MCC. We have the advantage these days of understanding their work and their conceptualizations from history.
Mm-hmm.
How do we keep from being colonial in our attitude toward them?
Yeah.
And how do we appropriately hold them accountable for what happened here on this land, or on this land here?
Yeah.
And still understand that they likely did the best they could with their narrow perspective back there. I don't know if you have additional comments to help me in my musing about that.
No, I think it's a really good question, and I mean, for myself, the way I would answer that is, I hope that the lecture didn't come across as, you know, back in the day people had this benighted understanding, and now we have reached this, you know, more advanced sense of understanding. When it comes to like dealing with legacies of colonialism, we are in some ways thrown into them. I had a professor, and I was a theology professor, who lectured mostly about the Reformation, but she had a lot of asides about contemporary issues. And she referred to racism, for example, in the United States, as in some ways it's like original sin. We're thrown into it, and we can't choose to be outside of it. We, our ancestors, and so in some ways it's not like we are now at a more advanced stage of the process where we can look back and judge. We are living with those, with that reality, and seeking the best we can to be aware of it and to be accountable for it. So yeah, I hope that it doesn't come across that I'm saying that, you know, previously people weren't aware of these things. They were aware of them. They were trying to deal with them imperfectly, just like we're aware of these realities, and we are imperfectly dealing with them, undoubtedly.
Just to follow up a little more on that, making the assumption that we're in solidarity in sin,
Mm-hmm.
so that we're not, it didn't happen back there, but we're participants in it, continuing to participate. In what sense then is a kind of restorative justice part of what the mission of MCC, certainly the mission of the church, but in what sense is MCC engaged in a kind of prodding of its own constituency, or all of us together, in a kind of restorative justice, a repair of the world?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I think there have been different ways that MCC has done that and continues to do that. The story that I ended with at the end from Saskatchewan is one where MCC was brought in by, you know, Canadian Mennonites in Saskatchewan, been approached by people from the Young Chipewyan who showed up and said, hey, this is our land by treaty that was violated, and they wanted to have conversations about, well, how do we approach this? And so MCC has been accompanying them. So in that way, in some ways, MCC's been involved, but it wasn't like the instigator of the conversation. In the United States, I mean, the Damascus Road program that was founded in the 1990s and then spun off from MCC around, I think, 2010, 11, something like that, and is now called Roots of Justice. That was a program that was more of a prodding thing, not just for MCC, but for Mennonite communities in the US that was seeking to provoke conversations that white Mennonites don't like to have, or it's not just white Mennonites, white people in the United States don't like to have conversations about their racial identity because it's uncomfortable. We don't like to think of ourselves as being racialized in a racist society. We like to think of ourselves simply as having this neutral identity. And so that was a thing that was more of a prodding thing. Now, to what extent does it get to a question of reconciliation? Of course, that assumes that people are in relationship with other people. And so to what extent are Mennonite churches, white Mennonite churches, predominantly white Mennonite churches, to what extent are they in relationship with Mennonites of color, with Mennonite churches of color? And so that's where the reconciliation type of thing would come in. So MCC there, in that example, has been more of a prodder, like in the 90s and in the first decade of this century. Was the Damascus Road program was playing more of that provocative prodding role of as an initial step towards potentially broader reconciliation work in Mennonite communities in the US.
MCC is certainly not the only relief, development, and peacemaking agency.
True.
There have been many others related to other denominational religious organizations or non-religious. Can you speak to how, if any, how does Anabaptist Mennonite theology and connection to the church shape the way MCC has engaged the issues you've been talking about? Or are we subject to a sense of exceptionalism, that we're special in how we've done that? Or what kinds of conversations have there been with other similar agencies also working at these issues?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. The third lecture tomorrow evening will look at MCC as well as broader humanitarian discourse and think not just of MCC as like an example of a Christian humanitarian organization, and how Christian humanitarian discourse aligns or is potentially in tension with broader humanitarian discourse. I mean, I think MCC sometimes does think of itself as exceptional, but clearly a lot of the developments within MCC have been mirrored within broader humanitarian practice. So like the shifts that I'll be looking at tomorrow morning in the convocation lecture of shifting understandings of service towards more patient listening and presence was mirrored to a certain degree within broader development discourse of the importance of participatory methods that are eliciting the voices of communities. So I think there are definite similarities in a lot of these things. With MCC articulating the rationale for them out of a particularly Christian grounding or framework, but other organizations are articulating it in terms of, like in the 70s and 80s, of a failure of state-led, state-focused modernization theory and a need for more grassroots led from the bottom up, from the ground up movements as contributing to more sustainable development, and with that theorizing not having any type of theological or religious framework to it. So I don't think that's necessarily a problem that there's a similarity in these things. I mean, in fact, I think it's quite interesting that there's a similarity to it. Where there's a difference is in MCC, in addition to being this relief, development, peace building organization, having essentially an additional mission, even if it's not always clearly articulated in MCC's history, as a mission of being this organization that keeps bringing Anabaptist Mennonites together in collaboration, if not necessarily in full communion in an ecclesiological sense with one another, in collaboration, and then continuing to expand the bounds of that collaboration outward within the circle of people who might embrace the word Anabaptist or Mennonite, but then beyond that into ecumenical collaborations, into interfaith collaborations, but always that commitment to engaging and expanding the circle of inter-Mennonite engagement, which is always a challenging and sometimes tentative and sometimes tenuous affair. But that's something that's different from, say, a World Vision or a Save the Children.
Shifting a little bit more to some of the outreach that MCC provides, did a source of alternative service workers have an impact on the direction that MCC went during then, when it does not currently have that demand?
Yeah, that's often been a question that has been asked within MCC. I think I first heard it when we first started with MCC in the 90s already, and probably even before that, of, once there's no longer the draft, and therefore an impetus for people looking for alternatives to military service, then are people going to continue to have that passion? Now, of course, even when there was the draft, that went hand in hand with sort of an optimistic idealism on the part of young Mennonites after World War I, during World War II, that included service by people who weren't being drafted, like women. You had lots of passion, desire for women in the 40s, who also wanted to be serving alongside CPS men, sometimes because the CPS men were their boyfriends or their husbands, but also just wanting to serve. And then in the voluntary service units that were founded after World War II, you had, I forget the percentage, it's at least 40% or it might be 60% of the participants in these VS units founded by MCC were women. But yeah, it's undoubtedly a function of MCC into the 70s was of providing these alternative service assignments, and that dried up then with the ending of the draft. And maybe that connects back too with the question of loyalty to MCC and what type of ownership do people have in MCC when you have fewer people who, whether willingly or unwillingly, are looking to engage in service because they have to, or it's either that or go into the Army. So MCC's continued to try to develop different types of service programs for young adults, but those programs are competing within a marketplace of other service programs, whether that's the Peace Corps or whether that's Youth with a Mission, YWAM, or other types of programs that are on offer. And it's also competing with the real sense of, I'm graduating with a staggering amount of debt, I need to get a job to start paying it off, and I don't have the luxury to do a 2-year or 3-year service term. That's a good question.
Okay, well, you have 2 opportunities tomorrow to hear Alan again. We will be back in this space at 11 a.m. During Convo, and then we will be back at 7 p.m. tomorrow evening. You're invited to both of those lectures. So please join me in thanking Alan again for his meeting.